Settle into your pillows, close your eyes, and let yourself drift into the ancient world of Atlantis. This is a tale of wonder, wisdom, and the eternal lessons of civilization. Long before recorded history, when the Mediterranean seas were young and the world was still finding its shape, the god Poseidon gazed upon the waters and saw an island of extraordinary beauty. The land rose from the ocean depths, blessed with fertile soil, gentle hills, and springs of both hot and cold water that bubbled from the earth itself. On this pristine island lived a mortal woman named Plato. She dwelt alone on a central hill, surrounded by meadows of wildflowers that swayed in the sea breeze. Her beauty matched the island's splendor, with eyes like the deep ocean and hair that caught the golden sunlight. Poseidon, ruler of all seas, fell deeply in love with her the moment he saw her walking along the shore, gathering shells and singing to the waves. The god descended from his underwater palace, his trident gleaming with power, and approached Plato with tenderness unusual for an Olympian deity. She was not afraid, for there was kindness in his eyes. They spoke for hours as the sun traced its path across the sky, sharing stories and dreams. Poseidon promised her safety, prosperity, and a love that would echo through the ages. To protect his beloved Plato from any harm, Poseidon reshaped the island itself. Using his divine power over earth and sea, he carved the land into a perfect pattern of alternating rings. 3 rings of water encircled 3 rings of land, creating a natural fortress that no invader could penetrate. Each ring of water was wide and deep, filled with fish and marine life that would sustain the future inhabitants. The rings of land grew thick with forests, orchards, and gardens that seemed to bloom with supernatural abundance. At the very center, on the original hill where Plato had lived, Poseidon built a magnificent palace. Its walls were made of red, white, and black stone quarried from beneath the island itself. These stones had unique properties. The red stone warm to the touch, the white stone cool and smooth, the black stone somewhere between, creating a harmony of temperatures that made the palace comfortable in all seasons. Plato and Poseidon had 5 pairs of twin sons, 10 princes who would become the founders of the Atlantean civilization. The eldest was named Atlas, and it was after him that both the island and the surrounding ocean would eventually be called. Atlas was born with wisdom beyond his years, his eyes reflecting both his father's divine nature and his mother's mortal compassion. As the sons of Poseidon grew to manhood, they proved worthy of their divine heritage. Atlas became the first king, ruling the central island and the most fertile portions of the land. His brothers received their own territories, dividing the growing empire into 10 kingdoms that would work in harmony for generations to come. The Atlanteans were not like other ancient peoples. They possessed knowledge that seemed to come from the gods themselves, though in truth it flowed from their divine ancestry and their own brilliant minds. They understood the movements of the stars with precision that would not be matched for thousands of years. They mapped the heavens, calculated the seasons, and predicted the tides with accuracy that served them in all their endeavors. Their architecture defied the limitations of the Bronze Age world. The central city, surrounding Poseidon's original palace, grew into a marvel of engineering and beauty. The alternating rings of land and water were connected by bridges wide enough for ships to pass beneath. These bridges were not simple wooden structures, but magnificent spans of stone, decorated with bronze and precious metals, supported by arches that demonstrated an understanding of mathematics and physics far ahead of their time. The Atlanteans excavated a great canal from the sea to the outermost ring of water, creating a harbor that could accommodate vessels from every corner of the known world. This canal was 50 stadia long, 300 feet wide, and 100 feet deep, an engineering achievement that required the labor of thousands and the genius of master builders who understood water flow, gradient, and the movement of tides. The city itself was a symphony of design and function. The outer ring of land contained the homes of merchants, craftsmen, and sailors. Markets bustled with activity from dawn until dusk, selling goods from distant lands, Egyptian papyrus, Phoenician purple dye, Baltic amber, and spices from the mysterious East. The air was filled with a dozen languages, the sound of hammer on anvil, the calls of vendors, and the laughter of children playing in the streets. The middle ring held the estates of nobles and administrators. Here stood grand villas surrounded by gardens where fountains played and peacocks wandered freely. The wealthy Atlanteans did not hoard their prosperity, but used it to create beauty that all could enjoy. Public gardens were maintained at private expense, and any citizen could walk the marble paths and rest in the shade of imported cedar and cypress trees. The innermost ring was reserved for temples, government buildings, and the homes of the royal family. The Temple of Poseidon dominated the landscape, rising 300 feet into the air. Its exterior was covered entirely in silver, while the roof gleamed with orichalcum, a precious metal unique to Atlantis, reddish gold in color, which was said to have properties that no other metal possessed. Some claimed it never tarnished. Others said it hummed with a subtle vibration when touched. Inside the temple stood a statue of Poseidon that inspired awe in all who beheld it. The god was depicted standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, his head nearly touching the ceiling. The statue was crafted from gold and ivory, with eyes of precious gems that seemed to watch over all who entered. Around the statue, golden figures of sea nymphs riding dolphins circled in a frozen dance, each one unique, each one perfect. The Atlantean society was organized with wisdom and justice. Unlike many ancient civilizations that relied on slavery and conquest, Atlantis built its prosperity on innovation and cooperation. Every citizen, from the highest noble to the humblest farmer, had a role and was valued for their contribution. Education was universal and thorough. Children began their schooling at age 5, learning to read and write, to calculate and reason, to understand the natural world and the movements of the heavens. They studied music and poetry, for the Atlanteans believed that a complete education must include the arts as well as the sciences. By adolescence, young Atlanteans could recite the epic poems of their history, calculate the area of complex shapes, and debate philosophy with their elders. The Atlanteans excelled in metallurgy beyond any other ancient people. They had mastered the extraction and purification of copper, tin, gold, silver, and iron. But their greatest achievement was orichalcum, which they mined from deep within the earth using sophisticated techniques that involved controlled flooding and drainage of mine shafts. This metal was used not just for decoration, but for tools and mechanisms that gave Atlantis its technological edge. Agriculture in Atlantis was both an art and a science. The island's volcanic soil was naturally fertile, but the Atlanteans enhanced it further with sophisticated irrigation systems and the careful study of crop rotation. They understood that different plants took different nutrients from the soil, and that alternating crops would maintain fertility indefinitely. Their farms produced 2 harvests each year, one from rain-watered crops in winter, another from irrigated fields in summer. The Atlanteans cultivated grains, fruits, and vegetables of remarkable variety. Orchards of apples, pears, and figs covered the hillsides. Groves of olives provided oil for cooking, light, and religious ceremonies. Grapevines produced wines that were traded throughout the Mediterranean world, but most remarkable was their cultivation of a fruit that grew nowhere else, a golden apple with sweet flesh that could be stored for months without spoiling, which travelers said could sustain life better than bread alone. They raised livestock with equal skill. Cattle, sheep, and goats grazed in managed pastures, rotated regularly to prevent overgrazing. The Atlanteans understood animal husbandry, selectively breeding for desired traits. Cattle that gave more milk, sheep with finer wool, horses with greater endurance. But most impressive were the elephants. Yes, elephants roamed Atlantis. Whether they were native to the island or imported from Africa was debated even in ancient times, but there was no doubt that they thrived there. The Atlanteans used them for heavy labor, transport, and ceremony. They treated these magnificent creatures with respect and care, understanding that their intelligence required patience and partnership rather than force. Atlantis's greatest power, however, came from the sea. As the children of Poseidon, the Atlanteans felt as comfortable on water as on land. They built ships that were faster, stronger, and more seaworthy than any others in the ancient world. Their warships were triremes, vessels powered by 3 banks of oars on each side, manned by rowers who trained from youth. These ships could achieve remarkable speeds, moving through the water like dolphins, capable of complex maneuvers that bewildered enemies. Their rams, covered in bronze, could split an enemy vessel in 2 with a single strike. But the Atlantean navy was not just for war. Their merchant vessels connected the entire known world in a trading network of unprecedented scope. Atlantean ships sailed to every shore of the Mediterranean, through the Pillars of Hercules to the Atlantic coast of Europe and Africa, and some whispered they had reached even more distant lands. The harbor of Atlantis could accommodate 1,200 ships at once. Imagine the sight at dawn. Hundreds of vessels preparing to depart, sails being raised, oars being positioned, crews calling to each other in the morning light. The harbor was organized with military precision, different sections for warships, merchant vessels, fishing boats, and personal craft. Lighthouse towers, each topped with ever-burning flames fueled by a mysterious process, guided ships safely to port even on the darkest nights. The admirals of Atlantis were chosen for their skill and wisdom, not their birth. Any citizen could rise through the ranks if they demonstrated competence and courage. This meritocracy in the Navy reflected the Atlantean belief that talent should be recognized wherever it appeared. The governance of Atlantis was established by Poseidon himself and inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum that stood in the temple. These laws were sacred, unchangeable, and surprisingly enlightened for an ancient civilization. The 10 kings, descendants of the original brothers, ruled their territories independently, but met every 5 and 6 years alternately to discuss matters affecting all of Atlantis. These assemblies were solemn occasions, beginning with a ritual hunt of a bull within the temple precinct. The bull was captured without weapons, using only ropes and nets, symbolizing the triumph of cooperation and intelligence over brute force. Once captured, the bull was sacrificed at the pillar of orichalcum, and its blood was allowed to flow over the inscribed laws. The kings then took an oath to uphold these laws above all personal interest. They swore to never take up arms against each other, to come to each other's aid if attacked, to make decisions about war and peace collectively, and to judge disputes fairly. The laws themselves were remarkable for their justice and restraint. They limited the power of individual kings, preventing any one ruler from becoming a tyrant. They protected the rights of citizens, ensuring that no one could be punished without trial or stripped of property without cause. They mandated care for the poor and elderly, treating such care not as charity but as obligation. Perhaps most remarkably, the laws prohibited the death penalty except for the most extreme crimes, treason, murder, and sacrilege. The Atlanteans believed that rehabilitation was possible for most offenders and that life was sacred, not to be taken except when absolutely necessary to protect society. Under these laws, Atlantis prospered for generations. Crime was rare because opportunities were abundant. Poverty existed but was not desperate, as the state provided basic sustenance and employment to all who needed it. Conflict between the kingdoms was virtually unknown, as the sacred oaths bound the rulers to peace. The Atlanteans pursued knowledge with the same passion they brought to commerce and engineering. Their scholars made discoveries that would be lost for millennia after Atlantis fell, only to be slowly rediscovered by later civilizations. In medicine, Atlantean physicians understood the importance of cleanliness in treating wounds. They knew that disease could spread through contaminated water and insisted on aqueducts and sewers to keep drinking water pure. They used herbs and compounds with remarkable effectiveness: willow bark for pain, mold extracts for infection, compounds we would recognize as primitive antibiotics. Their astronomers mapped the stars with precision, identifying constellations and tracking the movements of planets. They understood that the Earth was spherical, not flat, based on observations of ship masts disappearing over the horizon and the circular shadow the Earth cast on the Moon during eclipses. Some scholars even proposed that the Earth might orbit the Sun rather than the reverse, though this was debated. Mathematics flourished in Atlantis. Their mathematicians developed geometry to heights not seen again until ancient Greece, understanding principles of angles, triangles, and circles that enabled their architectural achievements. They calculated pi to several decimal places and understood the concept of irrational numbers. The arts were equally advanced. Atlantean sculptors created works of breathtaking realism and beauty. Their bronze statues captured not just the form, but the spirit of their subjects. You could see wisdom in a philosopher's eyes, courage in a warrior's stance, tenderness in a mother holding her child. These works were not stiff or formal, but seemed ready to step from their pedestals and walk among the living. Atlantean music employed scales and harmonies that were sophisticated and emotionally powerful. They had instruments of all kinds: stringed lyres and kitharas, wind instruments of bronze and wood, percussion instruments that marked rhythm. Their composers created symphonies for large ensembles, music for religious ceremonies, songs for common people to sing at work and celebration. Literature and poetry were treasured. The Atlanteans had an oral tradition of epic poems recounting the deeds of their ancestors, but they also wrote extensively. Their scribes used both papyrus and a unique form of paper made from processed sea plants. They wrote histories, philosophical treatises, plays, and poems. Their greatest poets were honored with public statues and annual festivals where their works were performed. For the common citizen of Atlantis, life was comfortable in ways that would not be matched in the Mediterranean world for thousands of years. Most families lived in stone or brick houses with multiple rooms, tile roofs, and small courtyards. Indoor plumbing was common. Clay pipes carried fresh water from the aqueducts, and wastewater drained into the sophisticated sewer system. The working day began at dawn. Farmers headed to their fields, craftsmen to their workshops, merchants to their shops. The climate was mild and pleasant, with warm summers and gentle winters that rarely saw frost. The work was hard but rewarding, as Atlantis's prosperity meant that even common laborers could afford comforts that nobles in other lands might envy. Meals were communal and social occasions. Breakfast was usually simple: bread, cheese, fruit, and watered wine or herb tea. Lunch was eaten at midday, often at work or in public gardens, consisting of bread, olives, fish, and vegetables. Dinner was the main meal, when families gathered to eat, talk, and share the day's events. Atlantean cuisine was diverse and sophisticated. They had access to ingredients from all over the known world through their trading networks. Fish and seafood were staples, prepared in countless ways: grilled, baked in clay ovens, made into stews, or preserved with salt. They ate pork, beef, lamb, and goat, usually reserved for special occasions. Vegetables included onions, leeks, garlic, lentils, beans, and cabbage. Fruits were plentiful and varied. They seasoned their food with herbs and spices, some local, some imported at great expense. Honey was the primary sweetener, harvested from apiaries maintained throughout the island. Wine was the common beverage, usually diluted with water, though they also made beer from barley and various fruit wines. Public entertainment was abundant and accessible to all classes. The Atlanteans held athletic competitions similar to later Greek games: running, wrestling, boxing, and chariot racing. These were not just for the wealthy but open to any citizen with talent. Winners received laurel crowns and public acclaim rather than wealth, as the honor was considered reward enough. Theater was popular, with performances in open-air amphitheaters. These were not simple entertainments, but sophisticated dramas exploring themes of justice, love, duty, and human nature. Comedies mocked the foibles of the wealthy and powerful. Even kings were not immune from satire, though it was always done with wit rather than cruelty. Religious festivals marked the year, celebrating the gods and the cycles of nature. The greatest festival honored Poseidon and was held at the summer solstice. For 3 days, work ceased, and the entire city celebrated with feasts, music, athletic competitions, and religious ceremonies. The festival concluded with a procession to the temple, where the king himself led prayers for the continued prosperity of Atlantis. For many generations, Atlantis remained true to the ideals established by Poseidon and maintained by Atlas and his brothers. The sacred laws were honored, justice prevailed, and the civilization flourished. But as the centuries passed, changes began to creep in, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious. The divine blood of Poseidon, which had been strong in the first generations, became diluted as the royal families married mortals. This was natural and unavoidable, but with the thinning of divine heritage came a gradual shift in character. The wisdom and restraint that had characterized earlier rulers began to fade, replaced by more common human traits: ambition, greed, and pride. The kings still met and performed the sacred rituals, still swore the oaths to uphold the laws. But increasingly these became empty ceremonies, words spoken without true commitment. In private councils, they spoke more of expansion and glory than of justice and service. The success of Atlantis had made it wealthy beyond measure. Gold and silver flowed into its treasuries from trade and from mines in subject territories. Orichalcum, once used judiciously for its sacred properties, became common, adorning even ordinary buildings. The temptation of such wealth was strong, and not all resisted it. Some of the nobility began to live with excessive luxury. They built private palaces that rivaled royal residences, filled them with treasures gathered from across the world, and surrounded themselves with servants and entertainers. They held feasts of wasteful abundance, competing to display their wealth in ever more extravagant ways. This excess would not have been fatal in itself. Many civilizations have survived periods of decadence. But in Atlantis, it was accompanied by a more dangerous change, a shift from defensive to aggressive military ambitions. The Atlantean navy, which had protected trade and maintained peace, began to be used for conquest. At first, the expansion was justified as necessary for security or to punish pirates, but gradually, the true motivation became clear: the desire for more territory, more resources, more power. Atlantean armies marched across North Africa, subjugating the coastal peoples. They crossed into Europe, pushing inland from their coastal settlements. They sent expeditions east, challenging the ancient powers of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The empire grew vast, but this growth came at a terrible cost to the Atlantean soul. With military expansion came slavery. This was perhaps the most profound betrayal of Atlantean ideals. The early civilization had been built on free labor and voluntary cooperation. Now prisoners of war were forced to work in mines, on farms, and in construction. This institution, once absent from Atlantis, became increasingly central to its economy. The presence of slavery corrupted Atlantean society in subtle and overt ways. Citizens who once took pride in their own labor now saw work as beneath them, suitable only for slaves. The connection between effort and reward, which had sustained the earlier civilization's vitality, was severed. Wealth became more important than virtue, power more valued than wisdom. The assembly of kings, which had functioned for generations as a council of equals bound by sacred law, became a gathering of rivals seeking advantage. Alliances formed and dissolved based on self-interest. The oath to aid each other in defense became a tool to coerce support for aggressive wars. Disputes that would once have been settled through mediation now simmered with potential for violence. In the capital city, the tone of life changed. The public spaces, once used by all citizens, became divided by class. Certain gardens were reserved for nobility, certain baths closed to commoners. The theaters still performed their plays, but the audiences became segregated, with the best seats reserved for the wealthy. The temples still functioned, but their role shifted. Religion, which had been a source of ethical guidance and communal unity, became more about ritual than meaning. Sacrifices were offered to ensure success in battle rather than to give thanks for peace. Prayers were made for personal advantage rather than communal good. The scholars and philosophers of Atlantis watched these changes with alarm. Some spoke out, warning that the civilization was abandoning the principles that had made it great. But their voices were increasingly ignored or dismissed as impractical idealism. The practical men of power had no time for philosophical concerns. They were building an empire. Not all Atlanteans embraced the new direction. Many common citizens maintained the old virtues of honesty, hard work, and community service. Farmers still tended their fields with care. Craftsmen still took pride in their work. Sailors still showed courage and skill. But they had little voice in the decisions that shaped their civilization's course. At its height, the Atlantean Empire controlled territories around the entire Mediterranean basin and beyond. Their armies had proven nearly invincible, their navy unchallenged. Tribute flowed to the capital from dozens of subject peoples, adding to Atlantis's already immense wealth. But this expansion created enemies and resentments. The peoples conquered by Atlantis did not forget their freedom. They chafed under foreign rule, even when that rule was relatively benign by ancient standards. They watched for any sign of weakness, any opportunity to rebel. Moreover, the expansion brought Atlantis into conflict with other great powers. The kingdoms of Asia Minor, the pharaohs of Egypt, and the tribal confederations of Europe all saw Atlantis as a threat. They began to form alliances, to share intelligence, to prepare for the day when they might challenge the island empire. Within Atlantis itself, the costs of empire were becoming apparent. The need for constant military readiness drained resources. Taxes increased to pay for armies and fleets. Young men left their farms and workshops to serve as soldiers, disrupting families and communities. The dead from distant wars were shipped home for burial, creating a somber parade that became increasingly common. The conquered territories provided wealth but also instability. Garrisons had to be maintained, rebellions suppressed, complex administrations managed. The simple, elegant governance that had worked when Atlantis was a single island became unwieldy when applied to an empire. The final war. The end, when it came, was not from a single cause but from a convergence of crises. The sacred assembly had become dysfunctional, with kings barely maintaining the pretense of cooperation. The subject peoples were in a state of constant unrest, requiring military force to keep them subdued. The Atlantean people themselves were divided, some clinging to old virtues while others embraced the new imperial ethos. Then came the decision that would prove fatal. The kings of Atlantis, drunk on their own power and convinced of their invincibility, made plans to conquer the entire Mediterranean world. They would march east to subjugate Persia and Mesopotamia, south to completely control Egypt, and west to the unknown lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules. To achieve this, they would need to defeat the one power that still stood somewhat independent, the city-states of early Greece. These were not yet the mighty powers they would become centuries later, but they were proud and free, and they had no intention of submitting to Atlantean rule. The Atlanteans assembled the greatest military force ever seen. Ships by the thousand filled the harbor, soldiers by the tens of thousands drilled in preparation. Supplies were stockpiled for a campaign that was expected to last years. The kings delivered speeches promising glory, wealth, and eternal fame to those who served in this great enterprise. The invasion was launched with confidence, bordering on arrogance. The Atlantean fleet sailed across the sea, landing armies on Greek shores. Initial victories came easily. The Greek cities, divided and unprepared, fell one after another. Within months, most of Greece was under Atlantean control. But the conquest was not as complete as it appeared. In Athens, a city that would later become famous for its wisdom and courage, leaders emerged who refused to accept defeat. They gathered the remnants of Greek forces and organized a resistance. What they lacked in numbers and resources, they made up for in desperation and tactical brilliance. The Athenians understood that they could not defeat Atlantis in conventional warfare. Instead, they struck at supply lines, ambushed isolated units, and gradually made the occupation costly and difficult. They sent envoys to other subject peoples, encouraging rebellion. They appealed to the gods for justice against the aggressive invaders, and the gods, it seemed, were listening. Poseidon had watched the decline of his descendants with growing sorrow and anger. The civilization he had founded with such hope, the laws he had inscribed with such care, the ideals he had established, all had been corrupted. His children had forgotten wisdom in favor of conquest, abandoned justice for power. Zeus, king of the gods, was also displeased. The Atlanteans had become arrogant, believing themselves equal to the gods. They attributed their success to their own brilliance, rather than to divine favor. They made sacrifices, but their hearts were not in it. The rituals were performed for show rather than genuine reverence. The gods convened in council on Mount Olympus. There was debate about what should be done. Some gods argued for patience, suggesting that Atlantis might still reform itself. Others called for immediate punishment. Zeus listened to all arguments, then made his decision. Atlantis would be destroyed. The method would be both natural and supernatural, an expression of divine will through the forces of nature. The earth would shake, the seas would rise, and the island that Poseidon had created would be reclaimed by the ocean that had given it birth. The catastrophe began with omens that only a few recognized. Birds abandoned their nests in unusual numbers, flying away from the island. Animals behaved strangely, dogs howling without cause, horses refusing to eat. The hot springs that had always provided warm water for the baths began to run cold, then hot again, their temperature fluctuating wildly. Those few Atlanteans who still maintained the old wisdom felt a growing dread. Some spoke of leaving the island, but they were mocked by the confident majority. Atlantis was eternal, they said. It had stood for countless generations, and would stand for countless more. Then came the earthquakes. The first tremor struck at dawn, strong enough to wake sleepers and rattle objects on shelves. It passed quickly, and though people were alarmed, they went about their day. But over the following hours, more tremors came, each stronger than the last. Buildings began to show cracks. The sophisticated aqueducts that brought water to the city were damaged, interrupting the flow. By afternoon, the earthquakes were continuous, a constant shaking that made it difficult to stand, impossible to work. The beautiful buildings of Atlantis, which had seemed so permanent, began to collapse. The Temple of Poseidon, which had stood for generations, swayed on its foundations. Inside, the golden statue of the god seemed to weep, or perhaps it was the cracks in the ceiling allowing rain to stream down the golden face. The harbor, always so carefully maintained, became a chaos of wreckage. Ships crashed into each other as the water heaved and churned. The great bridges that connected the rings of land cracked and fell, plunging into the water below. The lighthouse towers toppled, their eternal flames extinguished at last, but the earthquakes were only the beginning. As darkness fell on what would be the last night of Atlantis, the nature of the catastrophe became fully apparent. This was not just a natural disaster, but the end of everything they had built, everything they had been. The ocean began to behave in ways that defied nature, or rather, that expressed a nature controlled by divine anger. Massive waves, higher than the tallest buildings, rose from a sea that had always been Atlantis's friend and protector. These tsunami waves crashed over the outer rings of the city, sweeping away everything in their path. The carefully constructed system of canals and harbors, which had been Atlantis's pride, now became a liability. The waves rushed through these channels with amplified force, penetrating deep into the city. Water flooded streets, filled buildings, and dragged people and possessions back toward the sea. Volcanic eruptions added to the chaos. The volcanic mountain at the center of the island, long dormant, burst into violent activity. Lava fountains lit the night sky with hellish red light. Ash and stones rained down on the terrified population. The air filled with choking, sulphurous fumes. The people of Atlantis, who had thought themselves masters of their world, found themselves utterly helpless. The wealthy fled their palaces, only to find that gold could not buy safety. The kings abandoned their councils, their sacred laws forgotten in the rush to survive. Soldiers deserted their posts, running toward they knew not what salvation. Some tried to reach ships, hoping to escape by sea, but the harbor was a death trap of surging water and sinking vessels. Others fled inland, climbing to higher ground, but the earthquakes triggered landslides that swept them away. Still others huddled in buildings, praying to gods who had already passed judgment. In the temple of Poseidon, a small group of priests maintained their rituals, even as the building crumbled around them. They understood that this was the end, but they chose to meet it with dignity, serving their god until the last moment. When the temple finally collapsed, crushing them beneath tons of silver-covered stone, they died doing their duty. Throughout that terrible night, the destruction continued relentlessly. The sophisticated infrastructure of Atlantis, the aqueducts, the sewers, the roads, the bridges, all were destroyed. The magnificent buildings, decorated with precious metals and filled with treasures, were reduced to rubble. The beautiful gardens where fountains had played and rare plants had bloomed were buried under ash and debris or swept away by rushing water. By dawn, when survivors emerged to survey the damage, they found a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Where proud buildings had stood, there were only ruins. Where gardens had flourished, there was mud and wreckage. The harbor was choked with debris, broken ships, shattered buildings, and other things that survivors tried not to look at too closely. But the destruction was not yet complete. As the sun rose on the ruins of Atlantis, the survivors realized with horror that the nightmare was not over. The island itself was sinking. Throughout the day, the ground level steadily dropped. The rising water was not just from waves, but from the island descending into the sea. Buildings that had survived the night were now gradually inundated. The survivors retreated from the water's advance, climbing to higher ground, but the higher ground was shrinking hour by hour. The geological explanation was complex. The volcanic activity had destabilized the foundation of the island, creating voids that caused the land to collapse into the sea. But to the Atlanteans, the cause was clear. Poseidon was reclaiming the land he had raised from the ocean. The god of the sea was taking back his gift. A desperate evacuation began. Any ship that could float was pressed into service. People crowded aboard vessels designed for a dozen passengers, 50 or more clinging to the rails. They brought whatever they could carry, Some grabbed food and water, others seized jewels and gold. Still others clutched family heirlooms or sacred objects. The fleet of refugees sailed from the sinking island, looking back at the city that had been the center of their world. As they watched, the Temple of Poseidon, which had partially survived the night's destruction, slipped beneath the waves. The outer rings of the city disappeared next, the water swallowing streets and buildings with relentless hunger. By evening, only the central hill remained above water, the original home of Plato, where Poseidon had first built his palace. A few hundred people remained there, unable to escape or refusing to leave. As the sun set, they watched the water rising around them, knowing that they were witnessing the absolute end. Through the night, the last of Atlantis disappeared beneath the waves. By dawn of the second day, there was nothing to mark where the great island had been except disturbed water and floating debris. The civilization that had lasted for generations, that had created wonders and ruled an empire, was gone as if it had never existed. The survivors who had escaped faced a world transformed. Their ships were scattered across the Mediterranean by storms that seemed to pursue them even after Atlantis's destruction. Some landed on the coasts of Egypt, where they told their stories to disbelieving pharaohs. Others reached the shores of Italy, Greece, or North Africa, bringing with them fragments of Atlantean knowledge and culture. These refugees were the source of many ancient legends. Their stories of a great civilization destroyed by the gods were passed down through generations, becoming myths and legends. The Egyptians recorded some of these accounts in their temples, which is how Solon heard the story centuries later, and how it eventually reached Plato, who would preserve it for posterity. The Atlantean refugees influenced the cultures they joined. They brought techniques in metalworking, agricultural methods, architectural knowledge, and other skills that advanced the civilizations that took them in. Some scholars believe that the mysterious sea peoples, who attacked Egypt and other Mediterranean powers in ancient times, may have included Atlantean refugees desperate to find new homes, but the knowledge was fragmented and incomplete. The great libraries of Atlantis, containing the accumulated wisdom of generations, were lost beneath the sea. The sophisticated infrastructure could not be replicated without the resources and organization of the intact civilization. The refugees could describe marvels they had known but could not reproduce them. Over generations, the memories faded. The children of refugees heard stories of a great island, but these seemed increasingly like fantasies. The grandchildren heard only legends. By the time great-grandchildren were born, Atlantis had passed from history into myth. The empire that Atlantis had built dissolved rapidly. Without the central authority and the naval power that had maintained it, the subject territories regained their independence. The Greek cities that had resisted Atlantean conquest celebrated their liberation. The other peoples who had been conquered rebuilt their own civilizations, often stronger for having been unified in opposition to Atlantis. The island itself, sunken beneath the waves, became a mystery. Ships sailing over the area reported strange phenomena, unexpected currents, unusual watercolors, underwater ruins visible in clear water. Divers brought up artifacts, pieces of worked metal, fragments of carved stone, pottery shards. But these were tantalizing hints rather than clear evidence, and over time even the location was forgotten. The story of Atlantis, as preserved by Plato and others, was intended as more than entertainment. It was a cautionary tale about the dangers of moral decline, the consequences of abandoning virtue for power, and the ultimate futility of material wealth divorced from wisdom and justice. The early Atlanteans had built their civilization on solid foundations: respect for law, pursuit of knowledge, care for all citizens, and reverence for the divine. As long as they maintained these principles, they prospered. But when they allowed their divine nature to be diluted by mortal weaknesses, When they chose conquest over peace and pride over humility, they set in motion their own destruction. The tale reminds us that no civilization, however powerful or advanced, is immune to decline. The technological marvels, the military might, the accumulated wealth, none of these could save Atlantis when its moral foundation crumbled. The gods, representing divine justice, or perhaps simply the natural consequences of moral failure, would not permit such corruption to continue indefinitely. Yet there is also a note of tragedy in the story. Atlantis was not evil from its beginning, but became corrupted gradually, almost imperceptibly. Many individual Atlanteans remained virtuous even as their civilization declined. The farmers who tended their fields, the craftsmen who took pride in their work, the common people who maintained decency, in their daily lives, they suffered the same fate as the corrupt, kings and greedy nobles. This reflects a harsh truth about civilizational collapse. The innocent often suffer along with the guilty. When a society fails, everyone pays the price, regardless of their personal virtue. This makes the responsibility for maintaining civilizational health even more important, for we are indeed our brother's keeper in ways both profound and practical. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind wander through the ruins of Atlantis, now peaceful beneath the waves. Imagine the silent halls where once laughter echoed, the empty streets where merchants once called their wares, the gardens now populated by fish instead of children. Picture the Temple of Poseidon, its silver covering long since corroded away, its golden statue fallen and covered with coral. Sea creatures make their homes in the eye sockets of stone faces that once gazed upon splendor. Octopi glide through doorways that once admitted kings and philosophers. The great bridges that connected the rings of land are now artificial reefs, providing shelter for schools of fish that dart through the arches like memories of the crowds that once passed there. The aqueducts that brought fresh water now channel only salt water and currents. In the throne room, where kings once debated the fate of nations, only silence reigns, broken occasionally by the groan of settling stone or the distant song of whales. The Pillar of Orichalcum, with its inscribed laws, lies buried under silt and sand, its sacred words unread for millennia. The harbor that once accommodated 1,200 ships is now a vast underwater cavern, home to creatures that never knew sunlight. The lighthouse towers, which guided ships to safety with their eternal flames, are now landmarks only for passing whales and curious dolphins. But perhaps not everything is lost. Perhaps somewhere in those ruins, protected by silt or sealed in an air pocket, some record remains. Perhaps a library somehow survived, its scrolls preserved by some quirk of chemistry and circumstance. Perhaps the knowledge of Atlantis waits to be rediscovered, to remind future generations of both the heights humanity can reach and the depths to which it can fall. Throughout history, people have searched for Atlantis. Ancient historians attempted to locate it based on Plato's descriptions. Medieval scholars debated whether it was literal or allegorical. Renaissance explorers hoped to find it in newly discovered lands across the Atlantic. Some placed Atlantis in the Mediterranean, identifying it with Crete or Santorini, islands that were devastated by volcanic eruptions and tsunami. Others looked to the Atlantic Ocean, as Plato's account suggested, speculating about sunken lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Still others suggested more exotic locations, Antarctica, the Caribbean, even the Americas themselves. Archaeologists have uncovered impressive ancient civilizations that were unknown in Plato's time. The Minoans of Crete had sophisticated plumbing and beautiful art. The Mycenaeans built massive fortifications and traded throughout the Mediterranean. These discoveries showed that advanced Bronze Age civilizations were not impossible, making the story of Atlantis seem at least plausible. Yet no definitive evidence has been found. No ruins match Plato's description exactly. No artifacts clearly identify themselves as Atlantean. The truth about Atlantis remains elusive, dancing just beyond the reach of proof. Perhaps this is fitting. Perhaps Atlantis is meant to remain a mystery, a story that speaks to something deeper than historical fact. It represents the universal human experience of lost golden ages, the civilizations that came before us and disappeared, leaving only fragments and memories. Every culture has its version of Atlantis, a story of a great civilization that existed in the distant past and was destroyed by divine judgment or natural catastrophe. The Sumerians told of cities destroyed by floods. The Hebrews preserved the story of Babel and its tower. The Indians spoke of Dwarka, sunk beneath the sea. The Chinese remembered ancient dynasties lost in floods. These stories serve similar functions across cultures. They remind us that human achievement is fragile, that pride comes before a fall, that we must live in harmony with nature and the divine rather than in opposition to them. They teach humility by showing that even the greatest civilizations can vanish. But they also inspire us by showing what humans are capable of achieving. Atlantis, whether real or imagined, represents human potential at its peak. A civilization that mastered its environment, pursued knowledge, created beauty, and lived according to just laws. If it existed once, perhaps it could exist again. If it never existed, perhaps we could create it. The story of Atlantis asks us to consider what we would build if we could start fresh. What kind of society we would create if we had the wisdom of the gods and the freedom to implement it. It invites us to examine our own civilization and ask whether we are building on solid foundations or repeating Atlantis's mistakes. In the depths where Atlantis rests, the water is cold and dark. Sunlight penetrates only a short distance before being absorbed by the infinite blue. At those depths, pressure is immense, silence profound. Time moves differently in the deep, measured in centuries rather than days. Yet the ocean is not still. Currents flow through the ruins, carrying nutrients that feed the life that has colonized every surface. Volcanic vents, remnants of the activity that destroyed the island, still pour heat and minerals into the water, creating oases of life in the deep. Creatures adapted to total darkness make their homes among the remains of human ambition. Sometimes, in the absolute darkness, bioluminescent fish create moving constellations of light. They swim through palace halls where torches once burned, through gardens where flowers once bloomed. They know nothing of the civilization that built these structures, care nothing for the dreams and fears of long-dead humans. They simply live, as life has always found a way to do. The stone faces that once depicted Atlantean kings and queens are gradually dissolving, their features slowly erased by the patient action of water and time. In another 1,000 years, they will be unrecognizable. In 10,000, they may be gone entirely, return to the elements from which they were carved. This is the ultimate fate of all human works, to be worn away by time, dissolved by nature, forgotten by history. Yet there is something beautiful in this too. The atoms that once formed the statues will become part of new life, new structures, new stories. Nothing is truly lost, only transformed. Throughout the ages, mystics and visionaries have claimed that Atlantis will one day rise again. Some say it will physically emerge from the ocean, restored to its former glory. Others interpret this more metaphorically, suggesting that Atlantean knowledge will be rediscovered, or that a new civilization will recreate Atlantis's achievements. Perhaps both interpretations hold truth. Perhaps one day, archaeologists will discover unmistakable evidence of an advanced Bronze Age civilization, matching Plato's description. Perhaps we will recover knowledge that was thought lost forever, insights into science, philosophy, and human nature that could benefit modern civilization. Or perhaps the return of Atlantis means something deeper, the return of the values that made it great before it fell. The commitment to justice over power, wisdom over wealth, harmony over conquest. The recognition that true civilization rests not on technological achievement, but on how we treat each other and the world we inhabit. In this sense, Atlantis has never truly fallen. Its ideals persist, waiting to be embraced again. Every just law, every act of wisdom, every moment when humans choose cooperation over conflict is a small resurrection of Atlantis. We carry the seeds of that civilization within us, and we can choose to plant them. The story of Atlantis reflects the cycle of rise and fall that all civilizations experience. They begin with energy and idealism, grow through innovation and effort, reach heights of achievement and prosperity, then gradually decline as the original virtues fade and are replaced by complacency and corruption. This cycle has repeated throughout history. Great civilizations have risen: Sumeria, Egypt, Greece, Rome, Byzantium, the Islamic caliphates, the Chinese dynasties, the Aztecs, the Incas, each achieving remarkable things, each eventually declining and falling. Their ruins dot the landscape, testaments to both human greatness and human limitation. But each civilization also leaves a legacy. The knowledge they created, the art they produced, the institutions they developed, are passed on to successor civilizations. Nothing is entirely lost. The spiral of history may turn, but each revolution occurs at a higher level, building on what came before. Atlantis, whether it existed or not, is part of this great chain of human achievement. The values it represented, pursuit of knowledge, creation of beauty, establishment of justice, are values that transcend any single civilization. They are part of the human project itself, the collective effort to build a world worthy of our highest aspirations. As sleep approaches, let the story of Atlantis gently fade from your mind. The images become dreamlike: the golden statue of Poseidon, the ships in the harbor, the gardens in bloom, the philosophers in discussion, the children playing in the streets. See the civilization in its glory before the fall, when virtue and wisdom guided every action. Feel the peace that came from living in a just society, the security of knowing that laws protected all citizens, the joy of being part of something greater than yourself. The colors soften and blur. The sounds of the bustling city become distant, like waves heard from far away. The warmth of the Mediterranean sun fades to the comfortable darkness of your bedroom. You are floating now, drifting on gentle currents like the sea creatures that inhabit Atlantis's ruins. You are descending through layers of time and consciousness, moving from the bright surface toward the deep, restful places where dreams begin. The last image you see is the Temple of Poseidon, its silver walls gleaming in morning light, its golden statue watching over a city at peace. Then even that fades, and there is only the soft darkness, the gentle rhythm of your breathing, the quiet peace of approaching sleep. Sleep comes as the ultimate acceptance of our limitations, our mortality, the fact that we cannot control everything. It is a daily rehearsal for death, and thus a daily reminder to live fully when we wake. The Atlanteans, for all their wisdom, could not escape this truth. Kings and peasants alike needed sleep, regardless of their power or wealth. In sleep, all were equal, all vulnerable, all at peace. Perhaps this is why the story of Atlantis is so perfect for falling asleep. It reminds us that everything passes, and therefore everything is precious. Let go of the day's concerns. They will wait until morning. Let go of tomorrow's anxieties. They are not yet real. Let go of the stories, even the story of Atlantis. It has served its purpose, carrying you to the threshold of sleep. Your breathing deepens, slows. Your muscles release tension they've held all day. Your mind, so active during waking hours, finally begins to quiet. Thoughts arise and drift away like clouds, requiring no response, needing no attention. You are safe, warm, comfortable. The world will continue while you sleep, but it does not need you to watch over it. Others will do that work. Your work now is simply to rest, to release, to let yourself sink into the soft darkness that welcomes you. Imagine you are floating on a calm sea at dusk. The water is warm, supporting you effortlessly. Above, the first stars are appearing in a sky that deepens from blue to purple to black. Below, the water darkens to unknowable depths, but you are not afraid. The depths are peaceful, mysterious, inviting. Small waves lap gently against you, rocking you with their rhythm. They come from far away, echoes of distant storms that do not concern you. Each wave lifts you slightly, then gently lowers you, up and down in rhythm with your breathing, in harmony with your heartbeat. The stars above multiply as darkness deepens. They are the same stars the Atlanteans saw, the same constellations they mapped and named. That civilization is gone, but the stars remain patient and eternal, witnesses to all human drama, unchanged by it. You begin to sink, slowly, gently, into the warm water. It closes over you not with panic, but with comfort, like being wrapped in soft blankets. You can still breathe somehow. This is a dream ocean that obeys different rules. Down you drift through water that grows darker and darker. You pass schools of silver fish that scatter and reform like thoughts in a peaceful mind. You pass rock formations that might be ruins or might be natural stone. It doesn't matter which. The surface is far above now, a distant shimmer of moonlight. Down here there is only peace, only silence, only the soft pressure of water on all sides, holding you, supporting you, letting you rest. Your eyes are heavy, so heavy. It takes too much effort to keep them open. You let them close just for a moment, just to rest them, just for now. The darkness behind your eyelids is comfortable, familiar, safe. It asks nothing of you. It offers only rest, only peace, only the sweet release of consciousness slipping away. One last thought drifts through your mind. The story of Atlantis is not about an island that sank. It's about the eternal truths that persist even when civilizations fall. Truth, beauty, justice, wisdom, these cannot sink beneath the waves because they are not made of stone and metal. They exist in every heart that seeks them, in every mind that honors them. And with that thought, you let go completely. The story ends. The day ends. Consciousness fades like the last light in the western sky. You are sinking deeper now, into the most profound peace, into sleep that is restorative and healing, into dreams that may carry echoes of Atlantis or may wander to other places entirely. The temple of Poseidon watches over your descent, its golden statue a last glimmer in the darkness. Then even that is gone. Only sleep remains. Deep, peaceful, perfect sleep. Rest now, dream well. The ocean holds you safely. The night protects you. Tomorrow will come when it comes. For now there is only this gentle darkness, this soft silence, this perfect peace. Sleep. Let the waves carry you away. Into the deep, into the dark. Into rest, sleep,